5. Among the Gnomes, continued. We arrived at the king's palace, a description of which will undoubtedly interest the reader, and I only regret my inability to do full justice to this subject. The palace consisted of an extensive building of white alabaster upon a rose-colored marble foundation, and with a gilded dome-shaped roof over the main portion of the building, while the adjoining parts were shaped in various ways. The whole represented a mixture of Grecian and Moorish styles. There was a high portal whose columns were of white marble with veins of gold. Entering through the main door, we came into a spacious courtyard, filled with works of art, representing antediluvian monstrosities of the various ages of the world. There we saw the ichthyosaurus, plesiosaurus, and megatherium, and similar animals unknown in history. Enormous snakes, turtles, and crocodiles, in what is supposed to have been their original size and shape, and besides these there were represented such failures of nature as may have existed in the earliest time of the world's history. Women with fishtails, human bodies with animal heads, and animal bodies with human heads or limbs, fauns, mermaids, satyrs, centaurs, flying snakes, dragons, etc. Curiously enough, the gnomes claimed that these were the representations of their ancestors, and they paid great respect to them. This courtyard extended all around the palace, surrounding it like a ring. From this court we entered into an entrance hall built of yellow stone, at the door of which were standing two gigantic umbrella-shaped mushrooms of scarlet color with white filaments, resembling the finest kind of lace. This hall was exquisitely furnished and ornamented with various mushrooms, all of an edible kind, affording at once comfort and food. For while resting upon a lounge or sitting at a table, if one wanted to eat, all he had to do was to eat a piece of the furniture. There was the Agaricus deliciosus, Perseris, Campestris, Prunulus, Boletus edulis, Polyporus confluens, Hydrum repandum and imbriatum, the Clavaria botrytis, Morchella esculenta, Helvella crispa, Bovista nigrescens, and many others, whose names I have forgotten, and still others which even Professor Cracker has not yet classified. They were serving either as tables, couches, or chairs, and there was not a single toadstool or poisonous fungus among them. There were no chandeliers, lamps, or candlesticks of any kind, for the gnomes lived in a natural manner and needed no artificial lights. Each gnome was himself a light more or less luminous according to the degree of his or her intelligence. But to me, having no light of my own and no power to illuminate anything, it was a source of continual annoyance that I always needed the company of some gnome to keep me enlightened, as otherwise I would have been left in utter darkness and nothingness. Moreover, the light in which a thing appeared to me always depended on the color of the light of this, or that gnome who happened to be in my presence, which caused me to experience a continual change of opinions regarding the qualities of the objects I saw. From this hall, a flight of 7 marble steps led into the main building of the palace. This consisted of 8 divisions, each made of a different quality, while the whole was built in a star-shaped form, so that each division with its subdivisions was connected directly with the central chamber occupied by the king. But what was most curious about it was that in each division some special invisible genii or spirits seemed to preside. For in each a peculiar influence differing from the rest could be felt by anyone whose nerves were not made of cast iron, or who was not a blockhead. Thus the hall of the mushrooms on the north side breathed an air of luxury and enjoyment, while the room to the left of it was pervaded by a spirit of anxiety and dissatisfaction, and was visited only by those who by force of habit had become attracted to it, and who, so to say, found satisfaction only in being always dissatisfied. Chronic grumblers, misanthropes, people discontented with themselves and with everything. On the other hand, there were 2 rooms to the east, in which nobody could remain without being overcome by a feeling of awe, reverence, generosity, sublimity, and a deep religious sentiment. They were visited by the brightest of the gnomes, and served as places for contemplation. These rooms seemed to be empty, but they were not empty, because, while they were bare of all objects, they were filled with an overwhelming abundance of that spirit which is the creator or producer of forms. The southeastern portion of the palace contained the sleeping apartments of the royal family, and whoever entered there would sink into a state of torpor and forgetfulness. But the hall next to that, lying directly towards the south, inspired its inhabitants with a deep melancholy easily turned into anger. Another division towards the west was called the Chamber of Cunning, and used on certain occasions for the purpose of concocting schemes of revenge and intrigue. It was very seldom used at the time of my arrival, but became a favorite meeting room later on. As to the hall upon the north side, which was dedicated to all sorts of sensual enjoyment, it was the most attractive, but also the most dangerous of them all, and I am bound by promise not to divulge any of its mysteries. All these rooms were free of access to every gnome of good standing, but the division in the center, where the king resided, was open only to those who gained admission there. It was always guarded by a selected number of female soldiers, corresponding to our Amazons, and it was said that female soldiers were always chosen in preference because they were more faithful and reliable than the males among the gnomes. At the entrance of the king's chamber there were statues of gigantic size, reminding me of the ones at the British Museum which were brought there from Easter Island. They represented that prehistoric race of beings which the gnomes used to call man, or Homo divinus, and of which they claimed that it existed no more upon the planet Earth, having emigrated to other spheres and abandoned their country to hobgoblins, devils, and spooks. I must confess that in our country I never met with any human beings of such a superhuman aspect as was represented here. There were images of men and women of such noble mien and so awe-inspiring that they looked much more like gods than like specimens of the genus Homo bipex. And a resemblance to them can be found only among the statuary of the ancient Greeks. Here the king in person resided, and nobody dared to approach him without his consent and without being admitted by the Amazons. But the apartments of the princess were next to those of the king, and as I spent a great deal of time in her company, I also came very frequently in contact with her father the king. The most remarkable thing among the gnomes was that they could not distinguish falsehood from truth. They were incapable of saying anything else than what they themselves thought and believed, and they could not conceive of the possibility of telling a lie. This state of affairs was sometimes somewhat annoying, for it is not always agreeable to hear someone state his opinion about you right to your face. But on the other hand, it was advantageous in many respects. For instance, whenever I wanted to enter the chamber of the king, all I had to do was to tell the Amazons that the king wanted to see me. And I believe if anyone had told the treasurer of the kingdom that he was entitled to take the treasure away, the guardian would have delivered it up without hesitation. This, however, was only at the time of my arrival, and before an attempt of civilizing the gnomes was made. Time passed away rapidly, and I do not know how long I remained at the palace enjoying the hospitality of the queen and the company of the princess. But each day I learned more to admire Adalga's character, the simplicity of her way of thinking, and the purity of her affection. It is true that her want of modern education, her inability to hide her true sentiments, and her inexperience in the habits of modern civilization, especially in what refers to conventionalities, sometimes created a feeling of dissatisfaction in my mind. She did not know how to pretend sentiments which she did not experience. She knew nothing about logical quibbles and tergiversation, nor of the many sweet little lies that make life supportable among mankind. It never occurred to her to say anything just for the sake of using a little flattery or tickling one's vanity, or for the purpose of teasing, and of all such things which are much admired among people of culture she knew nothing. This I regretted, but I could not keep myself from admiring her naturalness and sincerity. We passed a great deal of our time in the hall at the north end, and the princess asked me 1,000 questions in regard to the constitution, customs, and habits of the human kingdom, the manners of its inhabitants, their object of living and occupation, and the immortality of their souls. I know, love of my heart, she used to say, that if I could only become fully identified with you, we would both be as one immortal being, and it is only the dark aspect of your nature which prevents this unification and identity. But why, dearest one? I asked, can you not become immortal without this unification that would destroy your identity? Have you not within yourself all the elements necessary for that purpose? Alas, no, answered the princess. These elements are within us, but they are capable of development only in the constitution of man, and therefore we strive to become human just as you strive to become gods. But the race of real human beings has disappeared, and only a spurious imitation is left. These are the ghosts and hobgoblins with whom intercourse is forbidden, and we are now doomed to be left for ages without any prospect of real progress, until a race of real men appears again upon the earth. I answered her questions as well as I could, assuring her that there were still a great many honest and noble-minded people among what she called hobgoblins and ghosts, and that they would be glad to contract marriages with gnomes and sylphs, if they knew that they could thereby be useful to them. I said that there were among us millions of people who did not know that they were immortal, but that thousands of clergymen were engaged in the occupation of making them believe it. I also said that new systems of ethics, morals, and philosophy were being invented almost every day, and that the world of humanity would soon become very much improved. "Oh, I wish I were a man," exclaimed Adalga. "This will be impossible in your present incarnation," I said, "but I will do all I can to develop in you a human mind and teach you all that men know." "Oh, do please," cried the princess, embracing me in the exuberance of her joy. "First of all," I said, "you must learn the rules of logic, syntax and induction, elation, postulation, assumption, and inference. You must learn to doubt everything you see and feel, and deny all you hear. Never believe anything unless you already know all the whys and wherefores, and never take anything for granted unless it comes from an authority which you believe to be respectable, and which is recognized as such by the crowd. Deny everything that you do not understand. Consider everybody a liar until he has irrefutably proved his veracity. Never let anybody get the advantage of you by showing yourself to him such as you are, and never do anything without getting a personal profit." I stopped, because I saw that these maxims were all gibberish to the princess, and that she did not understand what I said. But I resolved to try my best to instruct her, and to bring intellectual culture among the gnomes. During these happy days, and while waiting for the return of the three imbeciles, I highly enjoyed the novelty of my situation. My liberty was not restricted, and I had ample opportunity for studying the character and the habits of the gnomes, in which occupation I was liberally aided by the princess. Arm in arm we wandered or floated through the villages, visited the mines and observed the gnomes at their labor, and I was astonished at the untold amount of treasures in the Untersberg, the existence of which is little suspected. The gnomes on the whole were at that time an unsophisticated lot, because, owing to their simple nature, a gnome could only think one thought at a time. They were therefore not given to reasoning and argumentation, and lived fully contented. In fact, they were rather deficient in intellectuality, but in spite of that, or perhaps on account of it, they had a great deal of spiritual power. Falsehood, lying, hypocrisy, scheming, and willful deception were unknown to them, and as stated above, they always meant what they said, and took it for granted that everyone except a hobgoblin or spook meant what his words implied. Nor would it have been possible for a gnome to tell a willful lie without experiencing therefrom immediately a detrimental effect upon his constitution, for as it was the light of truth that made them luminous, the telling of a falsehood, or even the thinking of one, would have immediately diminished the amount of his or her luminosity, which would have at once become visible to the rest, or it might have extinguished their light forever. Thus they were, by the necessity of their nature, always open and sincere, and followed their impulses for good or evil without being guided by the reasoning intellect. Whatever was done by them was done in good faith, even if it was foolish. There never was any malicious intent. Being capable of perceiving the truth directly and without reasoning, by the power of pure reason or instinct, they could solve the most difficult mathematical problems by merely looking at the final result, and nearly every one of them could thus have made a fortune among us by giving exhibitions of his power as a mathematical phenomenon, without the least knowledge of mathematics. But they could not even make the smallest calculation, or draw any inferences from given factors. They knew what they knew because they perceived it, and there was no guessing about what they saw. I found them to be exceedingly impressible by my thoughts and emotions. I often amused myself with the lower orders of gnomes by making them act out what I thought. When I, for instance, imagined myself to be afraid of them, they would become immediately afraid of me and run away. When I became angry at them, they became angry at me, even if I said not a word nor showed it by my manners. I think that if I had secretly determined to kill a gnome, he would have unknowingly followed the impulse and killed me. This made me think of the story of Burckhardt of Tallenstein, and that perhaps many suicides may be thus due to the ire aroused in those semi-intelligent forces of nature which we find objectified in the kingdom of gnomes. There was one class of gnomes called pygmies, whose office it was to direct the currents of vital electricity in the earth to all places where the roots of the plants that grew upon the surface required it. This they did while they were in their disembodied state, when each of them was, so to say, like a magnetic current. But whenever they assumed corporeal forms they were very small, and perhaps for this reason they had a dislike against appearing in corporeal bodies, and did so only for the purpose of taking food, or for some other object which required material organs. They were composed of some substantial but bodiless active force, which they could cause to crystallize into a nucleus of latent energy. In such a condition they were very lazy, but when liberated they were very active. They were strong, and it was surprising to see what an amount of active force could be developed from a comparatively insignificant spark of energy. Next, there were the volcani, who were principally occupied with mineral life, having in their charge the growth and transformation of metals. Their substance consisted of a certain force for which we have no name, but which might be called an electromagnetic fire. By an exercise of their will, they were able to send a current of such vital electricity into a mineral vein, and cause gold and silver, iron and copper to grow. For it is a sign of short-sightedness if one believes that metals have no life and do not grow, because their growth is not so rapid and perceptible as that of the plants. Then there were the cubitali, and the substance of which they were formed was a kind of explosive force, which means that they could contract their fluidic bodies and expand them very rapidly, when the quick expansion caused a kind of explosion with a destructive effect. Whenever they assumed a form, they were about 2 feet high, well-built, and showing great muscular strength. They were, so to say, the hard-working class, and their principal occupation was the blasting of air and the cutting of rocks. And in spite of their robust appearance, they had a great deal of artistic talent, as was proved by the products of their labor that could be seen in the palace of the king. Furthermore, there were the acthnasi, constituted of acthna, an invisible subterranean fire, who, whenever they manifested themselves in forms and became visible, appeared like fiery globes and balls of lightning. They were, on the whole, stupid and dangerous, and it was said that on more than one occasion some of them had entered dreamland, as they called our world, and been seen by the spooks and returned no more. All of which may, perhaps, have been only a fable, believed only by the children of the gnomes. The acthnasi were said to create heat and cause upheavings of the earth, and some of our ancient philosophers believed them to cause explosions in our minds. However that may be, I never saw them at work, for they were uncouth fellows, and I loved to avoid their society. There were also the sagani, and they were the cleverest of all. They were tall and well-formed, resembling the human shape in stature and form whenever they assumed a body. They were from 3 to 5 feet high, but they had the power to elongate themselves from the normal size up to a length of 25 feet and more. Their principal occupation was to construct the astral models of plants after a certain type for each species, which they did by the power of their imagination. I have no other suitable word. And here I beg to add in parenthesis that, according to my observation among the gnomes, every plant, stone, or tree upon the Untersberg had its lephas, as it is called by the gnomes, or astral type within the astral body of that mountain, each being in some way which I am unable to explain, connected with the physical part of the corresponding organism, so that the physical and, to us, visible product was always the exact image and corporeal representation of its ethereal progenitor and counterpart that is invisible to us but visible to the gnomes. All the gnomes could at all times and at their own pleasure live in their ethereal states without any definite form, comparable to air or clouds or mists, where they could by an effort of will assume material and corporeal forms, each one according to his or her innate qualities. In their ethereal shape they could travel with the velocity of a thought and penetrate through the most solid rocks like a current of electricity passing through a bar of iron. But in their corporeal state their locomotion was comparatively slow, and the atmospheric air, not being their own element, caused great obstacles to their locomotion. For the purpose of passing through air, they had to employ cutting and blasting and other methods similar to those which we use for tunneling rocks. It is believed by some people that when our bodies are asleep, our spirits are free to roam consciously through space and experience things which we do not remember when we awake, but which appear to us at best as a dream. Something similar was the case with the gnomes. In their ethereal states, they were individual powers, as distinct from each other as electricity is distinct from light, or heat from sound, and as such they were in possession of consciousness and perception of a spiritual kind, and capable of remembering all they had experienced while condensed into a corporeal form. But whenever they assumed corporeal bodies, they had no distinct recollection of what they had been doing while in a state of dissolution, and this was explained to me by the fact that while in their ethereal state their brains were not solidified enough to register and retain the impressions which they received, but the higher impressions which they received while in their corporeal forms they remembered also in their ethereal state, and whenever a gnome entered into the ethereal state he knew all that he had been doing in the same state before. Moreover, there was a state in which they lived in a semi-corporeal and semi-ethereal condition, and this was when they had not fully dissolved their forms, but merely assumed the shape of a globe of light. From all this it will appear that it is as difficult for a gnome to penetrate into our world as it is for us to penetrate into theirs, and even, as it often may happen, a gnome, while in his incorporeal form, visits mankind, he will not remember anything about it when he returns, or it will appear to him like a dream. And this may be the reason that our world has gained the reputation among the gnomes as being a dreamland, and nothing more. It may be a dreamland to them as theirs is to us, but they appeared to me to live and exist in their own sphere as much as we in ours. As to the rest, they were born, ate, drank, slept, married, and evaporated after death. Each family and each tribe of gnomes had its own head and leaders, whom they implicitly obeyed, without even knowing the possibility of disobedience, because they were not given to arguing, and all were ruled by Bim Bam I. The administration of the kingdom was very simple. There were no taxes to pay, and everyone had what he wanted, because nobody wanted more than he had. The king took whatever he needed, and never more than he cared to have. Custom house duties, monopolies, privileges, and corporation nuisances were entirely unknown, and there was no newspaper to disseminate gossip, cause dissensions, and ruin characters for the sake of getting up a sensation. There were no shams. The nobility consisted of gnomes that were truly noble, and not merely pretended to be so. The doctors actually knew something, and did not merely make believe that they were in possession of knowledge. The goodness of the good could be estimated by the amount of light that radiated from their stars, and their character was indicated by the color of the star. Consequently, each individual sphere of light slowly changed when a new emotion or virtue grew in a gnome. Anger made them red, love blue, intelligence yellow, sensuality green, wisdom violet, and so forth. The ladies of the gnomes occupied positions similar to those of our wives and daughters. The lower classes joined the males in their work. The higher ones were of a more ornamental character and protectors of arts. The world of gnomes, the same as ours, would have been dreary without female beauty and loveliness. Many of the novices were exceedingly beautiful and ethereal, others were homely, but all of them were very amiable, because they acted in a natural manner, made no attempt of disguising their feelings, and knew of no such thing as deceit. Neither did they disfigure their forms by absurd fashions in dress. Lovemaking and wooing were carried on among the gnomes as it is with us, only with the exception that the females had the same right as the males to bestow their affection and to make proposals. Neither was it considered a disgrace for any lady to do so. On the contrary, it would have been a disgrace for her to pretend to have other sentiments than she had, and it would have injured her beauty and destroyed her light. There was, however, no such thing as what is understood among us as women's rights, for their natural instincts taught them that not everything that becomes a male also becomes a female. These gnomes made no attempt to overstep the limits drawn by nature, for this would have caused them to become degraded and unnatural. On account of their simple-mindedness, immorality was entirely unknown, because true morality has its basis in the instinctive perception of truth, and requires no artificially concocted systems and shams. One may be very moral without even knowing that moral doctrines exist, and another may know all the moral prescriptions by heart and be a rascal for all that. There was one class of females distinguished from the rest. They were such as, having attained a certain age, were still without children. They corresponded to what is in our world called old maids, but they were neither old nor ugly. In fact, they were on the whole very charming and could sing beautiful songs, as everyone knows who has lived for a certain time in the vicinity of the Untersberg and heard them sing. Their songs are usually of a sad character and alluring. They express their loneliness and longing for children. The love for production exists in all departments of nature, and also among the gnomes. A gnome having no knowledge of his own is always happy to stuff his head with theories belonging to others, and loves them as if they were his own children. The same is the case with the so-called wild women of the Untersberg. Their love for offspring sometimes causes them to come out of the Untersberg and appropriate to themselves children of men, such as they find lost or astray within their realm. For this reason they are called wild, although I wish to gracious that I would never meet with anything less wild than they. I always found them very lovely, and I now understand the meaning of those popular tales which speak of children of peasants that have been abducted by these spirits and taken into the Untersberg, where they lived among the wild women, who treated them kindly and played with them, and after a certain time sent them back to their parents loaded with gifts. 6. Lucifer. Adalga, like all the rest of the gnomes, was a spirit, in the same sense as we are spirits ourselves. The term spirit implying a center of consciousness or intelligence, irrespective as to whether the form in which that spiritual power or energy dwells is visible to somebody or everybody or nobody. In this sense, the essence of everything is spirit, and every living form is a dwelling place or vehicle for a conscious spiritual energy, be it latent or active, as it could not otherwise be, if the world, as demonstrated by our best philosophers, is, with all its seen and unseen forms, nothing else but a manifestation of all consciousness, an attribute of the divine mind. In taking this view, I am well aware that I am assuming an attitude directly opposed to that of Professor Thomas Cracker, in his capacity as a representative of that modern science which regards the universe as being made up of dead lumps of matter, in which, in some inexplicable way, life and consciousness are produced by means of mechanical motion, due to the friction caused by their coming accidentally in contact with each other. I am also clairvoyant enough to foresee that Mr. Cracker and his learned colleagues will treat this story with contempt, if they should ever condescend to notice it, but this cannot be helped, and I resign myself to my fate. I will therefore not enter into a discussion concerning the merits of a philosophy resulting from looking at the universe in its spiritual aspect, or compare it with the absurdities resulting from a blind belief in materialism and its superstitions, but proceed to say that Adalga, being a spirit, in possession of an intelligence not due to mechanical friction, but due to the presence of an intelligent power in her own constitution, this intelligence of which she was possessed became manifested in her, and as time went on its manifestations increased, as might have been scientifically proved by the observation that she became more clever and intelligent. From this, it may be inferred that the princess was in possession of a mind capable of cognizing things by means of her bodily senses, and the facts which I witnessed every day went to corroborate the correctness of this theory. Moreover, there were indications that her mind was capable of cognizing the actuality of spiritual truths or principles, but being only a gnome, she was not capable of intricate reasoning and complicated argumentation. I often argued with her about the supposed immortality of the soul, and it seemed to me that Adalga was not substantial enough to be more than an ideal, and could therefore not be an enduring reality, because ideals require substance for becoming realized. In other words, the princess often appeared to me like a thought that may delight the present generation but be forgotten by the next. What she needed was matter or firmness, such as results from fixedness or stability of the spirit, and I came to the conclusion that I could supply her with the required material elements by her union with me. I know that I will be accused of making wild statements, unsupported by any well-authenticated scientific theory, but it will be seen that by means of my logical and inductive reasoning I arrived at the end at the same result, which Adalga seems to have perceived instinctively, and without any scientific training of her imagination, merely by her own direct perception. It may be inferred that Adalga had a soul, because she was alive and capable of having emotions, and in that soul seemed to be dormant a spark of a higher or spiritual life or consciousness, producing in her longings for the unknown, such as were expressed in her song in the cave. Longings which she herself could not explain, be it that her mind was not sufficiently developed to understand her own nature, or that she was deficient in a scientific training of her imagination. The tribe to which Adalga belonged was that of the Saguenay, the noblest of all the tribes among the gnomes, whose intellectual capacity was nearest to that of man. Being a Sagana, it was in her power to elongate her body, a circumstance which was at first terrifying and afterwards somewhat annoying to me. For often while we were sitting side by side, with arms interlinked, and engaged in the sweet occupation of exchanging our sentiments, would she forget herself, and suddenly elongating her body shoot up some 25 feet high by sheer force of habit, upsetting me, or carrying me up into space before I had time to let go of her arm or take it away from my waist. I begged her to restrain herself, and not to do so again in my presence. But self-restraint is a power entirely unknown among the gnomes. It is only possible for those beings who are in possession of a certain amount of spiritual self-consciousness, or in other words, who feel or know that they are somehow superior to their own nature, as I am bound to say, even if I risk being accused of believing in the existence of something supernatural. The gnomes do not realize anything higher than their own elemental nature, and can therefore not restrain it. Only man can do or keep from doing certain things from a sense of duty and superiority. It is true that even animals seem to restrain themselves, but it is their fear or other instincts which restrains them, and not the experience of anything higher than their natural animal state. They do not experience any superiority over their animal nature, because no such superiority is existing in them. Their motives for action are all to be found in their own natural world, while man's motives may sometimes spring from something superior than his own animal nature, namely from a higher and divine nature in him. To my remonstrances the princess used to answer, "It is my longing for the high, the sublime, and exalted which causes me to elongate my body involuntarily. I wish to grasp the infinite, and this makes me shoot up involuntarily." "This, my dear," I replied, "is not the proper way, and would not be permitted in polite society among us. Moreover, you cannot reach infinitude in this manner, which reminds me of the performances of certain scientific theologians who continually keep searching for God by means of a telescope. We cannot reach the infinite by stretching our limbs. We must grow and unfold from within by the power which we accumulate. This power, as it grows and expands, will cause our souls to unfold and develop. Instead of seeking for support outside of ourselves, we ought to be like a storage battery, filled with a living power that will radiate all over the world. This power is called love." "And can your clever men of science make love?" asked the princess. "Oh yes," I answered. "Love-making is a favorite occupation with many of our people, but the love they make is not the genuine article, but merely a spurious imitation. Genuine love cannot be made or manufactured, it is eternal. All we can do is to establish the conditions under which it may become manifest." "Oh, how I wish I could learn all that you know," exclaimed Adalga. "Will you not instruct me?" "With the greatest pleasure," I answered. "The first thing which you will require to learn is to distinguish the true from the false. You gnomes know that which is true, because you perceive it, but you do not distinguish it sufficiently from that which is false, because falsehood is unknown to you. The first requirement for you to attain a higher state of civilization is therefore to become acquainted with all sorts of falsehoods, deceptions, and lies." Adalga seemed to be frightened, and I therefore continued to explain. "Listen," I said. "You know that which is, because you perceive it, but you must also learn to know that which is not, so that you may distinguish it from that which actually is, and not mistake mere appearances for realities." "But if that which is not has no existence, how can we know it?" asked the princess. "We cannot truly know that which is not," I said, "except by experiencing its nothingness. We must ourselves become liars and cheats, Otherwise, we will always have only a vague idea of what lying and cheating means. We must be able to perceive that which is not, so that we may get some idea of that which is. But how can I perceive that which is not, asked Hidalga, if there is nothing to perceive? In the easiest way in the world, was my answer. It only requires a scientifically trained imagination. We will then be able to see anything we like, even if there is nothing. The princess was delighted. She looked at me with a face expressive of great admiration and said, "As the glowing tiny spark of the ruby grows into a large red light when it is joined by the flame, so my admiration of thee grows in beholding thy knowledge. No longer art thou veiled to my eyes, for the secret has been revealed, and I behold in thee not a man, but one of the sons of Lucifer, the god to whom no gnome can approach." "Nonsense," I said. "The story of Lucifer is only a nursery tale, an exploded humbug, annihilated by science." "What do you mean? Who is the Lucifer of whom you are speaking?" "The god of darkness. He who knows that which is not and does not know that which is. He whose temple is beyond the limits of our city, whose portals no gnome can enter without losing his light. Follow me." Thus saying, the princess dissolved, and assuming her spherical shape floated away, while I followed her as fast as my legs would carry me, for my curiosity was greatly excited. Beyond the city of Guyana, the capital of the kingdom of the gnomes, there is a wilderness composed of forests, jungles, and swamps. There you find sandy deserts interspersed with an occasional spot of verdure, and innumerable bogs over which will-o'-the-wisps are aimlessly wandering. Some parts are entirely bare of vegetation, others are covered with a luxuriant growth of curious trees, resembling the poison ivy, Atrus toxicodendron, upon which grows a tasteless fruit. There was also a species of crab-apple trees, and another bearing a certain kind of nuts, which were awfully hard to crack, and contained nothing but ashes. In some places the spot was covered with fine-looking but poisonous toadstools, and the ways were full of entangled vines and briars. The main road was leading to nowhere, for after following it until you were exhausted to death, you would find yourself exactly upon the spot from which you started at the beginning. In the midst of this labyrinth there stands a curious-looking castle, looking very solid and strong, with many fortifications, built of sandstone. There are thick walls, surrounded by moats, buttresses and counterforts guarded by banquettes, abattes, scarps and palisades, phrases and parapets, ditches and treus de loup, all of which look very formidable. But the light has such a peculiar influence upon the material of which the castle is built, as to cause the walls to decompose and rapidly crumble away. The very foundation of the building has so little solidity as to cause the walls slowly but continually to sink, so that it requires a continual repairing and building at the top to cause the castle to remain above the ground and to maintain a respectable appearance. It was in front of that castle that the princess reassumed her corporeal form, and as I approached nearer I found the walls ornamented with skeletons and skulls, and upon the top of the building waved a flag, consisting of a great many pieces of cloth of many different sizes and colors, sewed together in a haphazard manner, and this flag bore the inscription, "Knowledge is power." At the entrance of the fort there was a kind of a temple made of jet-black stone. A few steps led up to a door. "These walls," said my companion, "are the remnant of what was once a city built by a now extinct race of demons," and pointing to the temple, she added, "Here is the temple of him who knows that which is not, and does not know that which is." "And what is to be seen in there?" I asked. "Who knows?" exclaimed the princess. "This place is shunned by every gnome, and no one dares to enter. It is said, however, that it is inhabited by insane spooks, and by the remnant of a certain class of people who have spent their lives in doing many useless things. They are said to follow their accustomed occupations in an automatic manner, doing the same things over and over again without coming to an end." "And who were they, when they lived?" I asked. "Nobody knows," answered Hidalga. "None of these creatures knew himself while he lived. How could anybody know him after he died?" I expressed my determination to enter, upon which the princess grew very much alarmed and begged me to desist. But the more she sought to dissuade me from my purpose, the greater grew my curiosity to investigate the mysteries of Lucifer's temple. "Do not enter, O Mulligan," cried the princess. "It will destroy your light." "I have no light to lose," I answered. "I am not a gnome." "Woe to me," she cried. "Shall I lose you and my life even before our union has become completed? Stop this rash undertaking. Stop, O Mulligan, stop." "I must see the mystery of Lucifer," I exclaimed, while tearing myself away from Adalga's arms and making a rush for the door, which I entered, while the princess remained outside, wringing her hands and filling the kingdom of the gnomes with her lamentations and cries. The room into which I entered appeared at first perfectly empty and dark, but after a little while I was able to see two luminous spots of a reddish-yellow light at a distance, and some dark and voluminous object loomed up. Vague and undefinable nebulous shapes seemed to be flitting before my eyes and moving about. I confess that at first I experienced a feeling of something like fear and repugnancy, but nerving my courage, I went forward and soon stood before a gigantic figure representing a green frog squatting upon a stone, and from the eyes of the frog shone the phosphorescent lights which I had observed when I entered, looking like two fiery balls. The jaws of the frog were wide open, as if it were ready to devour anything whatever coming within its reach. Gradually my eyes became accustomed to the gloom, and I could read an inscription upon the pedestal saying, "Nulla ratio sign phosphor." Many years after that event I presented this inscription to the Academy, and respectfully asked for an explanation of its meaning. There were a few who claimed that it said it was necessary for the brain to contain phosphorus, so that the principle of mind could become active therein, and make a man capable of reasoning. But the great majority of the academicians claimed that reason itself was a product of phosphorus, and a mode of motion of its molecules in the brain. I was no longer afraid. I climbed upon the pedestal and examined the head of the frog, when I found that in the place of a brain there was a large lump of phosphorus enclosed in a film of colored glass. It was the light of the phosphorus shining through the colored glass that caused the lurid glow which came from the goggle eyes of the frog. This discovery made me laugh. "This, then," I said to myself, "is the celebrated Lucifer of whom the gnomes are afraid." Evidently the scientists of that extinct race attempted to create a living and thinking being in an artificial manner by making a compound of phosphorus to serve for a brain. But for all that they produced nothing but the dead image of a bullfrog. I felt tempted to smash the frog or to take the phosphorus, but for some cause, which is not quite clear to myself, I made up my mind to let it alone. I now became also able to see more clearly the nebulous forms that wandered about in space, and to my horror I found among them not only the shades of some prominent people well known in history, but also the apparitions of some persons with whom I was well acquainted. Among them was one who had spent all his life in trying to invent a perpetual mobile, and who to my knowledge is still living. As I approached him, I found him engaged in his usual occupation. He seemed to be aware of my presence, for he said, "There is only one little hinge which prevents the instrument from going. When this is overcome, it will work all right, and my name will be inscribed in the register of the Academy." "And of what benefit," I asked, "will it be to you to have your name thus inscribed, when you yourself are only a ghost? It is said that ghosts, like the gnomes, cannot speak otherwise than as they think, because they have not sense enough to prevaricate." He looked at me in surprise and merely answered, "Fool." He had become so much emaciated, and his voice sounded so hollow, that I began to doubt whether he actually was the one I had known in our world. I therefore asked him who he was. "Alas," replied the ghost mournfully, "I do not know who I am. While I was among the living I knew everything about science and philosophy, medicine and theology, spiritism and psychic research, but unfortunately I never knew myself. It is said that I made many inventions and discoveries, but as I do not know myself, I do not know who invented and discovered these things, and whether it was I or another. Moreover, I have forgotten them all." "But," I said, "why do you not try to find out who you are?" Another deep sigh expressed the profundity of his grief as he said, "Life is short, and I have no time to attend to that matter. First, I will finish this perpetual mobile, and after that I may have leisure to find out who I am and for what purpose I exist. I have now put these wheels together for the 10,695th time, and there is only one little hinge. After this business has been accomplished, I will turn my attention to more serious matters." I felt a deep pity for the ghost, in whom I now well recognized my friend, for the words spoken by him I had often heard him express before. I therefore said, "There is nothing to be said against entering into scientific experiments and increasing one's store of knowledge in regard to the laws of external nature and its phenomena. But a far more important thing it is to know one's own self and the object of one's existence, so that one may act accordingly and make the best use of life." "I know it," answered the ghost, "and I often said so myself, but I have now no time to attend to philosophical questions. I must finish this wheel." "Perhaps," I said, "you would succeed better if you were first to learn to know your real self and its powers, and construct your wheel afterwards, if you should still think it worth the while to spend your time with such nonsense." When I said this, the ghost became very angry, and said, "Avaunt, fool, and do not torment me. Get thee gone." So saying, the ghost snapped his jaws at me in a furious manner, and I barely escaped having my ear bitten off. I mournfully turned away, sadly grieved that such a bright intellect should have been allowed to evaporate in dreams. But I knew that it was of no use to argue with him, for my own experience with the jumping jack had taught me what a great power a fixed idea has over the mind. Another ghost, fearfully emaciated, now attracted my attention. He looked more like the shadow of a skeleton than a man, and was evidently at the point of starvation, but engaged in the ludicrous occupation of composing a bill of fare, while he himself had nothing whatever to eat. I looked over his shoulder and saw him write out the following prescription: déjeuner à la fourchette, waitress, consommé tapioca à la julienne, potage crème d'asperges, fruits au bleu, sauce à la russe, bœuf à la mode aux macaroni à l'italienne, selle de mouton hollandaise, oeufs brûlés aux molettes, immense de Fazer à la Windsor, canard braisé en Bordeaux, omelette soufflé, plum pudding, purée de pommes et noccles au naturel, fromage suisse, glacé panache aux gaufres cornets, Bordeaux, champagne, dessert, café. And where are all the good things whose names you have written?" I asked. "This," he answered haughtily, "you will have to find out yourself. It is sufficient if I indicate to you the order in which I might eat them if I had them. Does this not satisfy you?" "It might satisfy my curiosity," I replied, "but it will not cure your hunger or make you fat. You seem to me to need something more substantial than mere theories." "Knowledge is power," said the ghost. "When you have acquired the knowledge how to eat in good style, you may apply it as soon as you get the chance." "Look here, my friend," I answered. "It seems to me that you need very much a chance to get something to eat, even if it were not served up in the style proposed by you. Would it not be better to let this bill of fare alone, and seek for some food?" "I have no time to attend to that," replied the ghost. "I must first settle the theory. The practice may wait." "But by that time," I said, "you may be starved to death." This remark seemed to annoy the ghost, for it was true, and ghosts never like to hear any truth that goes against their own pet theories. Being themselves made up of delusions, a spark of truth is to them a foreign element, and burns them like fire. "Go away," he cried angrily. "Do not waste my time. I shall not permit any scoffing at science." As I turned away, I saw another ghost of still more pitiful aspect, clothed in rags, the very personification of abject poverty. Want and misery were looking out of his hollow cheeks, and his eyes were buried deep in their sockets. He was making a long calculation. "What are you calculating?" I asked. "Do not disturb me," he said. "I am calculating the interest which I would receive if I were to inherit all of Mr. Vanderbilt's money and estates, and how much, with the compound interest added to it, it would amount to in 100 years, and I want to see whether this would be enough to enable me to live comfortably in my old age. I have now been over this calculation for many years, but I must begin it again, because the value of the stocks has again changed, and there is a difference in the amount of the interest." I was surprised to hear that a person of such a beggarly appearance should have such excellent financial prospects, and I said, "When do you expect to make that inheritance, and could you not get now some money on credit on the strength of your prospective income?" To this the ghost replied, "Alas, no." I have no prospect of making any inheritance whatever, and there is no one who would lend me a penny. But it is such a comfort to know how much money I might enjoy if I had it, and what an amount of interest the capital would bring if I were in possession of it. And could you not do some work for the purpose of earning some money? Alas, no. I have no time for that. I must finish this calculation first. But what good will it do to you, I asked, to know all that stuff, as long as you are in such a state of poverty? The ghost shivered. He looked at me scornfully and said in an angry tone, "Knowledge is power. Do not waste my precious time. Be gone." Thus going from one to another, I found all these specters employed in occupations which had no practical purpose and served at best to amuse their imagination or gratify their curiosity. They all spent what little energy was left in them for the purpose of wasting their time, making themselves believe that they were doing something useful. They were all occupied with that which is not, and did not know that which is. They amused themselves, so to say, in worrying about the question what nothing might be if it were something, and in doing so they turned the only something they had, namely, their energy, into nothing. They were all dreams themselves, products of dreams, existing in dreams, leading a dream life and doing nothing but dreaming. All they did was imaginary and had its origin in their own imagination. One of the ghosts, becoming angry, flew at me and stumbled and fell down. Thereupon it never occurred to him that he could get up again, but he remained floundering upon the floor, uttering pitiful lamentations. Some ghosts were playing cards, and although their continual losing was a source of annoyance to them, they had not the power to stop. Others imagined that they had to imitate everything that they saw another ghost doing. This class was very large. One ghost practiced target shooting, but as he was all the time looking in quite another direction than where the target was, he always missed the mark, but wept bitterly and complained of his want of luck. But it is not possible to mention all the follies which I saw the ghosts commit in the palace of Lucifer. They were like insane people, reasoning cleverly but without being in possession of reason. I pitied them, and sick at heart I turned towards the door. In the meantime, owing to the cries of distress uttered by the princess, great crowds of gnomes had gathered in front of the temple, but none dared to enter. The king and the queen and all the court had arrived. They were all running and floating to and fro and talking and gesticulating, everybody giving some good advice which nobody followed. They did not know what to do. That anyone could enter Lucifer's temple and come out again alive, or otherwise than blind or insane, seemed to them an impossibility. The king looked very grave, and the princess was in despair. "After all," I heard the queen say to the princess, while trying to comfort her, "Mulligan is nothing but a hobgoblin." "No," cried Adalga, "I know he is a man." While speaking these words, the princess elongated her body to its full length, and looking towards the temple, saw me standing upon the threshold, and in spite of the cries of her mother, who tried to stop her, she flew to me, and the next instant she was in my arms. The door had not yet been closed, and from the interior a ray of yellowish light, coming from the eyes of the green frog, fell upon the princess. I sought to shield her with my person, but it was already too late, for that ray mingling with the blue in Adalga's sphere, immediately produced therein a permanent shade of green. A shout of joy arose from the multitude when they saw me issue from the temple, and never-ending hurrahs resounded. But this was changed to groans of distress when they beheld the change of color which had taken place in the princess. The king was very much distressed, and while pulling his hair and beating his sides, he cried, "Unfortunate was the hour when this magician entered my kingdom. Was it not enough that our beloved daughter had the misfortune of falling in love with this wretch, and taint her beautiful silver white with a nasty blue? Having given her the blues, he now causes her to expose herself to the rays of the frog. Oh, that I had never been born, or seen the hour of such misery! Let the executioner come immediately and execute the sentence of death." A storm of indignation arose, and the vivisectors appeared. However, I was not afraid. I knew now the character of the gnomes and knew what to say. "May it please your majesty," I said, "as well as our gracious queen and all the venerated assembly, to behold their beloved princess in this beautiful garment of green, whose splendor surpasses everything that has ever been seen before or may be seen afterwards. I call those present to witness that the princess never was so charming as since she has turned green. Green is the color of hope and indicates the beginning of wisdom. In the kingdom of man, green is the favorite color. Green is the grass of the earth, the trees and plants, and even the ocean waves turn green when they come kissing the shore. But why should I waste words in praising a color whose superiority is acknowledged by everyone who is capable of judging its beauty? Has not Her Gracious Majesty, the Queen herself, shown the superiority of her taste by choosing the emerald as the jewel of her heart and adorning her person with green as the true expression of her excellent qualities? Verily, I am giving only expression to the feeling of every intelligent gnome who loves his dynasty and his country, if I request you to join me in the cry, "Hurrah for green!" And "Hurrah for green!" was shouted by all, over and over again. Owing to my eloquent speech, green at once became the fashionable color, and everyone wanted to become green. They lauded and praised me as the benefactor of gnome kind, and the ladies thronged around me, congratulating me and begging of me to give them a shade of green. When order was somewhat restored, I made a few more remarks, calling everyone a traitor who would not join me in my predilection for green. I said that the princess and I loved each other, and that I would have married her in spite of her being blue. But now, as she had turned green and resembled her mother, she had become 1,000 times dearer to my heart. Here, however, I am bound to confess for the sake of truth that my statements were not strictly correct, for the queen's color was of the pure and beautiful hue of the emerald, while the color of the princess was an impure or dirty green, not at all comparable with the former. However, we all knew that on certain occasions a few little rhetorical liberties must be permitted. The king was very much pleased. He believed every word I said. He called me his benefactor and savior of his country. He conferred on me on the spot the office of Grand Chancellor of the Kingdom and Superintendent of Public Schools. He decorated me with the insignia of the Order of the Bullfrog, and consented that the ceremony confirming my engagement to the princess should take place immediately, to be followed by the marriage as soon as the 3 dwarfs would return with their discovery of the sun. When the king had finished giving this decision, he embraced me and the princess, and this was also done by the queen and her maids, by the ministers and high dignitaries that were present, and by their wives and daughters, mothers and mothers-in-law. But the rest of the gnomes danced and shouted and stood upon their heads, swinging their legs as a token of joy. The princess was radiant with smiles, and we all were very happy. Cravata even said that this was the happiest day that had ever been seen in the kingdom. We returned to the palace, where preparations were made immediately for a great festival. The best mushrooms that could be found were collected and prepared by the best cooks. Some were boiled, others stewed, and some dished up raw. The queen herself assisted in the kitchen work. The court musicians arrived. The palace was decorated in great style, and deputations came, not only from all parts of Bim Bam's country, but also from neighboring states. I received a fine suite of apartments adjoining those of the king and the princess, together with a lot of attending servants to keep my rooms continually illumined, for which purpose the most radiant gnomes were selected. But I will not impose upon the patience of the reader by describing the festivities which took place when the still beautiful Princess Adalga became Mr. Mulligan's bride. I will only say that during the most solemn moment of the ceremony, when the mutual promises were exchanged, it seemed to me that I distinctly heard the triumphant croaking of a frog, but no one else noticed it, and it may have been only an effect of my own imagination. 7. Digging for light. I was now tolerably well satisfied. From the abject state of a nobody, existing only as a subject for scientific observation, looked upon as a hobgoblin, and doomed to vivisection prisoner of a jumping jack, I had suddenly become somebody of importance, owing to my cleverness and to the credulity of the king. I saw myself now raised to the highest dignity in the kingdom of the gnomes, and engaged to a most amiable and charming, even if a little green, princess, and there was momentarily nothing to be desired except the discovery of the sun and the completion of my marriage. This discovery of the sun caused me a certain uneasiness, but I hoped that the king would not continue to insist upon that condition. A considerable time had elapsed, and nothing was heard of the dwarfs or their expedition. It seemed to me not at all improbable that they had fallen into the hands of Professor Cracker, and were now bottled up in alcohol, adorning the shelves of some museum. At all events, I had not the faintest hope that even if they were to return, they would have discovered anything worth speaking of, or be able to describe it, and I therefore thought of means for persuading the king to alter the stipulation in regard to my marriage, and to permit it to take place before the discovery of the sun. This I did not think very difficult, for the king was very changeable and did not seem to know his own mind. Although, whenever he got some idea into his head, he was very stubborn and self-willed, nevertheless he was easily led by the nose by those who knew how to flatter him. His capriciousness was shown by the rashness with which he ordered my execution, and his instability by changing his mind and making me Grand Chancellor of his kingdom. For this purpose I sought and obtained an interview with the king, and asked his consent that the marriage between myself and the princess should not be delayed. I proved to him by arguments that the sun could not do otherwise but exist, and that it was merely a question of time to discover it, that this event would perhaps not take place as soon as we wished it, but that this would make no difference to the sun. I took especial pains to explain to him that the interests of the state would suffer by my being doomed to live as a bachelor. But the king had never studied logic, and was inaccessible to my arguments. "I want the sun," he cried, growing more than usually red in his face. To this I replied, "If your majesty will permit, we all know that life and light and heat come from the sun. The sunlight does not penetrate into your kingdom because the rays of the sun are refracted upon the surface of the earth, but the caloric rays of the sun penetrate through these rocks, otherwise there would be no heat and life, and everything would be cold and dead in this place. Now, as you feel the warmth within your residence, you will easily see that there must be a sun." "I see nothing," answered the king. "All that you say may be as you say, but it does not enable me to perceive the sun." "And would it not be just as well," I said, "if your majesty would accept my information that there is a sun? If I tell you so, you will know it, and knowledge is power." But the king would not agree. "I perceive," he said, "that you tell me that there is a sun, but for all that I do not perceive the sun itself, and cannot eat it or have it deposited in my treasury." This stubbornness of Bim Bam I irritated me somewhat, and I said, "All that your majesty says goes to show that the gnomes will have to travel still a long way before they will come up to our standard of science. We, the scientists of the human kingdom, do not need to acquire or possess or even to see anything, much less to eat or absorb it into our own constitution. It is quite sufficient for us to have a theory about it which is believed to be correct. This is what we consider to be real knowledge." "What a fool's paradise this must be," exclaimed the king. "In our country we enjoy that which we are and possess, and care very little about theories and opinions." While we were engaged in this conversation, Cravatu entered, and brought the news that the three dwarfs had returned, and that everything had come out exactly as I predicted. For these imbeciles, not having sense enough to find their way back, had been found in the vicinity of the place where they had been left. All that could be made out by their incoherent speech was that they had seen something, but what that was nobody knew, for they were totally unable to describe it. This fulfillment of my prediction raised me still higher in the estimation of the king, who, seeing that I could foretell future events, looked upon me as a kind of supernatural being, and wanted to be instructed in that art. "It is very easy," I answered, "if your majesty will only study logic, and instead of directly looking at a thing, reject the evidence of your senses and begin to argue from the basis of what you assume to be true. Logic is the method of reasoning from particulars to generals, or the inferring of one general proposition from one or several particular ones. Which means that instead of looking at a thing as a whole, and afterwards examining its parts and the relations in which they stand to it, we must look at some separate part and imagine the rest. It is a process of demonstrating to our own satisfaction and to the satisfaction of everyone who believes in our judgment." Here I was interrupted by the loud snoring of the king, who had gone to sleep in his chair. The sudden stopping of my speech had the effect of awakening him. He yawned, and elongating his body to its full length, he stretched his limbs, and then went on to say, "This is very interesting, and I want to have this method introduced in all the schools of my kingdom, But for the present, the most important thing is the discovery of the sun, and I want you to discover it without further delay." I suggested that this might be done after my wedding, but the king sternly replied, "No son, no marriage, that's all." Being so near to the completion of my happiness, I was exceedingly grieved to see my hopes wrecked by their fulfillment being made to depend upon an impossible condition. But a happy thought struck me, and I said, "I assure your majesty that the sun is right over our heads, and there is nothing to prevent you from seeing it as soon as you will get out of this mountain, except the atmospheric air, which, unfortunately enough, is impenetrable to your sight, while I can easily enough see through it. Under these circumstances, the only thing that can possibly be done will be to cut a hole through the air, and make a tunnel deep enough until you will reach the outer limits of the atmosphere, when there will be nothing to prevent you from seeing the sun." This proposal pleased the king exceedingly, and Cravatu could find no words strong enough to express his admiration of my wisdom. They both knew already enough of logic to understand that they would be able to see the sun if there were nothing to hinder them from seeing him. Accordingly, orders were immediately issued that the best laborers, miners, and mechanics should be selected for the purpose of cutting a hole in what they called the sky. For the sky for them began there where their own element, the earth, ended. On the very next day the work was begun. They selected a place on the very top of the Untersberg. The pygmies drilled the holes, the Vulcani did the blasting, the Cubitali furnished the required materials, and the Sagani superintended the work, giving directions. We had the pleasure of seeing that already during the first 24 hours a hole of about 10 feet depth, and with a diameter of 10 feet, was made as the beginning of the tunnel for enlightenment. Thus day by day, or, to speak more correctly, night after night, the work went on. For when it is day in our world no work is done by the gnomes, as with the beginning of sunrise they fall into a state of lethargy, from which they awaken only after the night has set in. Every night the king and the queen with her maids, the princess, myself, and the high dignitaries of the kingdom, went out to see the progress made in the work of the tunnel, and every night the hole grew deeper to a certain extent, according to the quality of the material which had to be cut. But when it began to dawn upon the surface of the earth the gnomes went to sleep and slept so well that nothing could have awakened them from their slumber. In the meantime I considered it my duty to give great attention to the education of the gnomes, and to the development of their power of drawing inferences from things unknown. For the purpose of enabling them to distinguish the true from the false, I established schools of logic all over the country, in which all sorts of lies were taught, so as to give them a chance for using their own common sense and finding out the truth for themselves by overcoming the falsehood. Soon I was in possession of a corps of capable liars for assisting me in this work, but the education of the princess I took into my own charge. At first Hidalga did not enjoy the lessons, which is only natural, as the birth and beginning of everything is painful and difficult, but after a while she became delighted with my instructions. As my method may prove to be interesting and instructive to my compatriots engaged in pedagogical enterprises, I will illustrate it by an example. First of all, I tried to explain to the princess, by practical experiment, that a good scientist can never know anything whatever. He can only know what a thing is not, but not what it is, and from what he perceives that it is not he draws his inferences as to what it may be. Thus, for instance, taking a stone and handing it to Hidalga, I said, "Queen of my heart, will you tell me what this is?" "With pleasure," she answered. "It is a stone." "How do you know it?" "Because I see it." "Sight is deceptive," I said. "It may be a pumpkin." "I do not care what it may be. I know it is a stone." "How can you prove it?" "I do not need to prove it. I know it, and so does everybody who knows a stone." "You cannot know it," I said, "unless you can give any rational reason for your belief." "I do not need to give any reasons for it. I am satisfied to know what I know." I saw that I could not get the better of her in this way, so I said, "Will you have the kindness to imagine this stone to be a pumpkin?" "Well, Mr. Mulligan," she answered, "if this gives you pleasure, I shall imagine it to be a pumpkin." "Now take a bite of it, my darling," I said. "I can't, and you ought not to ask me anything so absurd." "But why can't you?" "Because it is too hard." "Exactly," I exclaimed. "And now as you have discovered that it is too hard for being a pumpkin, You have a scientific right to infer that it is not a pumpkin and may possibly be a stone. Quod erat demonstrandum. This way of making a simple thing very complicated, according to the strict rules of exact science, pleased the princess very much and amused her greatly. It now became necessary to show to her how we may arrive at a knowledge of universals by drawing logical inferences from particulars. For this purpose I told her that we must never trust to our reason, but only put faith into our method of reasoning. Pointing to the stocking which the princess was just knitting, I asked her what it was. A stocking, she said. I thought you knew that much already. Who is going to wear it? I. And what are you? A princess of this kingdom. Do all the princesses of this kingdom wear stockings? All those whom I know. Very well, I replied. The consequence is that all the people who wear stockings are princesses of the kingdom of the gnomes. This seemed strange to Adalga, but she could not prove that it was not so, and I proceeded to explain to her that the power to draw logical inferences was the highest power which a scientist could possess, and that by means of logic almost anything could be proved, be it true or false. Thus I proved to her by way of an illustration, first, that white was black, secondly, that black was white, and thirdly, that there was no color at all. White, my dear, I said, is, as everybody knows, no color at all, for it is produced by a combination of all the prismatic colors in the same proportion as they exist in the solar ray, where each color neutralizes the other. Now, if there is no color, there can be no light, and where no light exists, everything is as black as night. And if everything is black, white must be black also, and consequently white is black. Very strange, exclaimed Adalga. If white is black, I continued, it follows that black is white, because if there is no difference between two things, they must be identical. Moreover, everybody knows that black is no color at all, but the negation of color, and it follows that if a thing has no particular color of any kind, it must necessarily be white. Incredible, exclaimed the princess. There is nothing incredible about it, I said. It is all very reasonable. Moreover, there is no such thing as a color at all, for what we call by that name refers only to a certain sensation which is produced in our brains by means of certain vibrations transmitted through the retina and the optic nerve. If you look at any colored thing in the dark, you will find it to be without any color at all. The sensations we receive are only due to certain vibrations of something unknown. What is a vibration? Asked Adalga. Vibration, I said, is nothing but a certain kind of motion, and as motion per se does not exist, vibration is nothing, while that unknown thing which moves must be everything. But the existence of that unknown thing is not admitted by science, and consequently science knows nothing of everything, and of everything nothing, just as you like. And you can make nothing out of everything and everything out of nothing at your own pleasure. The princess was delighted to hear that she could now make everything out of nothing, although for the beginning it could be done only theoretically, and her repugnance to philosophical hair-splittings faded away. She continued her lessons with great diligence, and very soon I had the pleasure of seeing that she believed nothing and denied everything. A few weeks more, and I was highly gratified to find that she could no longer tell a mock turtle from a tommy cat without entering into a long series of arguments for the purpose of proving which was which. Unfortunately, in proportion as she lost her power of perceiving the reality, while improving in the practice of logic, her own light grew more and more dim, her luminosity less, and the green color in her sphere darker. But I considered this as a matter of only secondary importance, for it is said that beauty is a perishable thing, while wisdom remains. Sometimes she was inclined to worry about the fading of her charms, but I reasoned her out of it, saying, if everything is nothing, then, as a matter of course, beauty also is nothing, and it is not worth the while to worry about the loss of nothing. But, objected Adalga, if beauty is nothing and nothing is everything, beauty is everything, and we must do all we can to preserve it. Beauty, I replied, among our people is the outcome of fashion. If it were to become fashionable in our world to wear goiters and hunchbacks, everybody would find it beautiful and adopt it at once. And even if he did not find it beautiful, he would pretend to find it so. Thus it often happens that everybody wears a most ridiculous article of dress, not because he thinks it beautiful, but because he thinks that others do so. In this way, the people act foolish and silently laugh at each other for being such fools. This I should think to be very immoral, objected Adalga. Human morality, I replied, is also a matter of custom. What is considered very moral among one nation or class of people is considered immoral among others. Some, for instance, regard stealing as a disgrace, others as a proof of great ingenuity. But we will not enter into these social questions. We would never come to an end. What you need for the purpose of evoluting into a higher and nobler sort of a being is, first of all, the 3 steps or mental operations by which you will proceed from particulars to generals, and from generals to still higher generalities by means of rejections and conclusions, so as to arrive at those axioms and general laws from which we may infer, by way of synthesis, other particulars unknown to us, and perhaps placed beyond the reach of direct examination. "Oh my!" exclaimed the princess, and I saw that my explanation was not very clear to her. But this is excusable in a gnome, and I did not despair. There is nothing more certain than that religious speculation without science leads to superstition. But it is also true that scientific speculation in regard to philosophical questions leads to blind materialism and insanity if it is carried on without any religious basis, which means spiritual perception of truth. Adalga overdid the thing because she was of an impulsive, fiery nature and not used to self-restraint, and when I discovered the mistake it was too late to remedy it. I had taught her never to take anything for granted, and the end of it was that she doubted my words, disputed and denied everything, and always did the very contrary of what we expected her to do. It is said that a little learning is a dangerous thing, and I would add that the greater the learning, the greater the folly. If at the foundation of all that imaginary knowledge there is no instinctive perception of truth, or what we call intuition. The head of the princess became developed at the expense of her heart. The vital powers, which ought to have been distributed harmoniously through her system, went almost exclusively to furnish her intellect, and the consequence was that her head increased enormously in size, while her heart began to shrink. Her sight became dim, so that she could no longer distinguish right from wrong. Her joyfulness left her. She became dissatisfied with herself and with everything. A continual scowl rested upon her face, and it was no pleasure to spend an hour in her company. Her former friends stampeded when they saw her approach. I often tried to make her understand that at the basis of all creation there was an universal power, which has no name, but which men call God, and which those who reject that term, because they have formed a false conception of that which is beyond all human conception, might call by some other name, such as love, reason, all consciousness, divine wisdom, etc., and that she might feel the manifestation of that power within her own soul, if she would only pay attention to it. "Prove it," she cried. "Prove that I have a soul, or that anybody has such a thing, and which has never been discovered by science, neither in the pineal gland nor in the big toe. Show me that soul, and let me examine it, and I will bottle it up and preserve it in the museum." "Soul means life," I replied. "How can you know that you have a life, except by the fact that you are living?" "Fiddlesticks," exclaimed the princess. "There is no such thing as life. What seems life to you is only a phenomenon produced by the mechanical action of brain molecules, the result of indigestion." I was frightened to see the effects which my premature revelation of the mysteries of science had upon the princess. In vain I reminded her of the sentiments which she formerly used to have, and which were expressed in her song in the cave at the time of our first meeting. She called all these things childish fancies, unworthy of the serious attention of science. Alas! Her study of the phenomenal side of nature would not have been objectionable if only her spiritual culture had not suffered by that. But while her intellect grew strong by overfeeding, her soul became starved to death. Neither would she listen to my admonitions. She could not realize the possession of anything higher than the ever-doubting intellect, and this was probably because she was only a gnome. One day, when I actually thought her reason was entirely gone, I said to her, "Adalga, dear, do you know me?" "Don't dear me," was her answer. "How can you ask such a foolish question? I know that I have an image of somebody on my brain, and that its name is said to be Mulligan, but whether your qualities correspond to that image or not I have not yet discovered. For all I know, The Mulligan with whom I fancy myself to be acquainted may be only a product of my own imagination. It seems you love me no more? I inquired despondently. What is love but an effect of the imagination? She answered. If I chose to fall in love with a pitchfork and bestow my affection upon it, it will do me the same service as to love Mr. Mulligan. I assure you, I said, true love is an entirely different thing. That which you describe is only some kind of fancy. Prove it, she exclaimed, as usual, but alas, I could not prove to her that whose existence she could not experience. To make the matter short, Adalga became so scientific as to lose all her loveliness of form and character, and became overbearing, ugly, conceited, and foolish, and the same was the case more or less with all the rest of the gnomes. The whole population became clever and cunning, but, at the same time, lying and hypocritical. Formerly they had been moved, as it were, only by one will, namely, the will of the king. Now everybody wanted to rule everybody else, and nobody rule himself or be ruled by another. There was nothing but quarrels, disputes, dissensions, dissatisfaction, and selfishness. The gnomes lost their perception of truth and their light. The kingdom grew dark. Formerly, everything had been peaceful, but now it became necessary to employ force for the purpose of keeping order. Each gnome cared only for his or her own interests, and this caused fights. One of the first requirements was the establishment of a police. I soon found that the employees of the government, including the police, could not be relied upon. I therefore had to establish a corps of detectives and employ for that purpose the greatest rascals, because it is known that it requires a thief to catch a thief. These detectives had again to be watched by others, and from this ensued an universal espionage, which was intolerable. Moreover, everybody seeing himself continually watched, was thereby continually reminded that it was in his power to steal, and the end of it was that the people considered it to be a great and praiseworthy act if one succeeded in stealing without getting caught. At the time of my arrival, it was the custom of the gnomes to believe everything that anybody said, but now it became fashionable never to believe anything whatever. The consequence was that each believed the other a liar. Each mistrusted the other. Nobody spoke the truth if it was not in his own interest to do so. Nothing could be accomplished without bribery. Crimes became numerous, and it became necessary to establish jails all over the country. There was one curious feature noticeable, especially among the Saguenay, who now constituted the great autocratic body of scientists. The more learned they became, the more narrow-sighted they grew. They lost the power to open their eyes and decided upon every question according to hearsay and fancy. Their limbs became atrophied and their heads swollen. Some became so big-headed and top-heavy that they often lost their balance and fell down. It was especially funny to see how they tumbled about whenever one forgot himself, and by force of habit elongated his body. Finally, narrow-sightedness became so universal that a gnome without spectacles was quite a curiosity, and it has been reported that even children with spectacles upon their noses were born, but of this I have no positive proof. To my horror, the head of the princess grew larger and stronger every day, and two hard horn-like excrescences began to appear upon it at the place where the phrenological bump of love of approbation is located. At the same time, she grew exceedingly stubborn and vain. She was continually surrounded by flatterers who imposed upon her credulity. She could bear no contradiction, and nevertheless craved for disputes for the purpose of showing off her great learning. She lost her former natural dignity and self-esteem, and in its place she acquired a great deal of false pride. But her love of approbation revolted against the idea that anybody might consider her vain, and for the purpose of avoiding such a suspicion she joined gnomes of doubtful character and went into bad company. Let me draw a veil over the history of these sad events. Even now, although having resumed my individuality as Mr. Schneider, I can look back only with deep regret upon the change that overcame the charming Princess Adalga, owing to the ill-timed instruction of Mr. Mulligan. As to her father, the king, instead of comprehending the sad state of affairs of his kingdom, he took a very superficial view of it. He was delighted with the intellectual progress of the princess, and with the advancement of culture among his subjects, and he overwhelmed me with tokens of favor, calling me a public benefactor for civilizing the gnomes. Bim bam I. did not care to enter himself into the study of logic and elocution. Nevertheless, he did not wish to be regarded as a fool. He therefore tried to give himself an appearance of being learned, and whenever his arguments failed, he became very irascible and lost his temper. He was excitable, but too great a lover of comfort to remain long in an excited state, and for this reason he was easily pacified. Often he would get raving mad, bucking his head against the walls. But a moment afterwards he would go to smoke his pipe, as if nothing had happened. More and more the influence of the green frog was felt spreading through the kingdom, and there were some who claimed to have seen him wandering about the streets, spreading poisonous saliva from his mouth, from which green and red-spotted toadstools grew. The world of the gnomes became continually more unnatural and perverted. Impudence assumed the place of heroism, sophistry the mask of wisdom, lecherousness passed for love, hypocrisy paraded the streets under the garb of holiness. Those who succeeded in cheating all the rest were considered the most clever. The most avaricious gnomes were said to be the most prudent. He who made the greatest noise was thought to be the most learned of all. Nor were the ladies exempt from this general degradation, for they assumed the most ridiculous fashions, putting artificial bumps on their backs and wearing tremendous balloons in the place of sleeves. They lost their simplicity, were full of affectations and whims, and to do anything whatever in a plain and natural way was considered vulgar. But what is the use of continuing to describe conditions which everyone knows who has visited the Unnersberg within the last few years? It is sufficient to say that the country of the gnomes at that time resembled to a great extent the human-animal kingdom of our days, and I would have wished to leave it if I had not considered it my duty to remain for the purpose of trying to undo some of the mischief which had ignorantly been caused by my prematurely opening the door of the palace of Lucifer. 8. War. Dark and gloomy grew the kingdom of the gnomes in proportion as the light of each individual inhabitant decreased. Many who formerly were like luminous spheres, shedding radiant rays to a considerable distance, now became like dim will-o'-the-wisps, or merely phosphorescent dots or firebugs. As the general darkness increased, the glow that came from the eyes of the green frog in Lucifer's temple, whose doors were now continually open, became more visible, and at certain times the frog actually seemed to be alive. The ghosts in the temple continued their accustomed occupations without making any progress whatever. The perpetual mobile was always on the point of completion, but never completed. The bill of fare was continually altered, but there was nothing to eat, and the calculations made by the imaginary heir produced no interest. All the ghosts repeated the same follies again, which they had been in the habit of enacting before. Meanwhile, the work in the tunnel went on with great speed, and the hole in the sky grew deeper every night. But it was impossible to say how long it would take to finish it, as the depth of the atmosphere which had to be penetrated was not known. I estimated it to be about 1,000 miles, and calculating the work at about 5 feet a night, I found that the tunnel would be finished in 24 years, which was rather a long time to wait for the completion of my marriage. Moreover, one very serious inconvenience made itself perceptible. The working men had become so big-headed as to render it impossible for more than 3 gnomes to work in the tunnel at the same time without bumping their heads together. This delayed the progress and caused fights, and the question of widening the tunnel had to be taken into consideration, which would necessarily cause a considerable expense. Already the country was groaning under the heavy burden of an exorbitant taxation required for the heads of science, who did the hard work of thinking, for paying salaries to professors, policemen, pensioners, supporting prisoners and blind people, and especially for supplying with luxuries the royal family and their hangers-on. Especially the princess required a great deal of cash for her support. Her external appearance had become rather uncanny, and she therefore needed costly dresses and ornaments to hide her deformities. Her head, having grown to an enormous size, resembled the showcase of a jeweler's shop, being hung over with chains and jewels, while a crown, or to speak more correctly, a tube of gold, adorned her occiput for the purpose of hiding the 2 horn-like excrescences. I was one day consulting the king, and tried to demonstrate to him the necessity of using some economy in curtailing his private expenses, as otherwise the whole country would be involved in financial ruin, but I found him quite unreasonable in that respect. "I should like to know," he exclaimed, "what is the use of my being the king, if I cannot get all the money I want? Everything, I said, belongs to your majesty, but it will be to your own advantage to see that the resources of the country are not squandered, for, when the production ceases, there will be no more income. Well, said the king, if the people refuse to pay, I can still depend upon my army, and we shall see. Just at that moment we were interrupted by loud reports like explosions, following each other in rapid succession. This was followed by shouts and cries, and immediately afterwards Cravatu came rushing into the palace, and approaching the king, he said, "May it please your majesty to take command of the army. The laborers making the hole in the sky have perforated the frontier of the kingdom of the spirits of the air, and the inhabitants offer resistance." The king, having still a certain amount of perception of truth, did not get at all excited upon hearing this news, but lighting his pipe, he took a few whiffs and said, "What about it? I do not blame them. We can do nothing else but retire." Just then the princess entered, and, hearing these words, she exclaimed, "Rot! Who ever heard of a king of the gnomes being afraid of the spirits of the air?" "I never," replied the king. "Well then," continued Adalga, "we must beat back the intruders and force our way through their kingdom." The king was easily influenced, especially when his ambition was touched. Therefore the words of the princess caused him to fly into a rage. First he grew red in the face, his features expanded from ear to ear like an India rubber bag. Next, he jumped several feet from the ground and came down again with a thump. After that he threw his pipe upon the floor so that it broke, and stamped upon it with his foot. Finally, he lowered his head and butted it against Cravatu. And, after all this was done, he began to yell, crying at the top of his voice, "We must drive the rascals away. We must force a passage through them." A tumult was heard in the anteroom, and directly numerous gnomes rushed in. They were merchants and traders, and came to make offers for furnishing supplies for the army. They were underbidding each other, each offering to the king a greater bribe for accepting his offer. The king accepted some of the bargains which seemed to afford to him the greatest profit for his private purse, and the goods were delivered. They consisted of barrels labeled flour, and filled with sand, carloads of leather shoes made of pasteboard, wooden hams, and cartridges filled with sawdust. Also something that looked like a cannon, but it was made of wood and varnished, so as to give it the appearance of bronze. We left the palace, and the blowing of horns indicated the locality of the combat. On the way we met a train of wounded gnomes, some exhibiting a pitiful aspect. All the wounded had terrible burns and scalds, and the limbs of some were torn away. One poor fellow had lost the whole of his lower jaw, which was dreadful to see, and he seemed to suffer great pain. Why do not these people assume their ethereal forms, and thus get rid of their suffering bodies? I asked the minister. "This art," answered Cravatu, "is now becoming very difficult, and there are very few capable of exercising it, since we have become so substantial. Moreover, these people cannot do so at all, because it is necessary for that purpose that one should entirely forget his body, and how could we do that, if the sensation of pain or of pleasure keeps our attention fastened to it? For the purpose of throwing off the mask of personality and entering into the state of selflessness, an entire forgetfulness of self is required, such as is almost impossible to attain in our present state of civilization." The wounded we met became more numerous as we approached the battlefield, and here and there could be seen a corpse, stiff and stark, slowly but surely evaporating. When we arrived the explosions had already ceased, and Clavo, the general in command, approached upon a bicycle and made his report. From this it appeared that in trying to enlarge the tunnel, the laborers had entered into side issues, and by blowing out a large block of air, made an opening into a foreign region of unknown extent, which was inhabited by a tribe of sylphs or fairies, unknown to science and not yet classified. These spirits had resented the intrusion, and prevented the approach of our soldiers by pouring upon them sheets of fluid lightning with the most destructive effect, so that all resistance was rendered impossible, and they were forced to retreat after experiencing a considerable loss. "There is nothing to be done," said the general, after finishing his account, "but to let these airy spirits alone and begin a new tunnel in some other place. They are not of an aggressive character, and will not molest us if we go away. We have, anyhow, no right to trespass upon their territory. This is exactly what I always said, the king replied. What business have we to meddle with these good spirits? Let us go. But the princess interfered. Rot, she cried, good spirits indeed. Let them be exterminated. Will your majesty let them deprive us of our glory? Their resistance is an insult to you. No words can express the pitch of rage to which these words aroused the king. Growing purple in the face and fairly screaming, he elongated himself to 3 times his natural size, and bumping his head against the wall, as was his habit whenever he fell into a passion, he cried, let them be exterminated. Their resistance is an insult to me. Kill them, cut off their heads. And falling down in an epileptic fit, owing to the excessiveness of his fury, he stamped with his feet and kept on yelling, kill them, cut off their heads. I thought that perhaps the matter might be settled in an amicable manner, and therefore I told the king that rashness was not always the best policy, and I asked for permission to send a messenger, under the protection of a flag of truce, to see whether or not a treaty could be made with the spirits of the upper world. This is exactly what I always said, replied the king. Rashness is not always the best policy. We must send a messenger by all means. Accordingly, Cravatu and myself were appointed to that office, and we went. The undertaking was not without danger, as the nature of the enemy and their habits of thought were not known, and it was not at all improbable that we should receive a shot of lightning at our approach. However, we arrived safely at the lower end of the tunnel, and, looking up, we saw a great number of blue lights moving above like a swarm of bees. Cravatu, putting his hands to his mouth, shouted up through the hole, "Peace be with you." We listened. The motion among the bees increased, and after a while we heard a very sweet music, as if of a silver harp and lute. This was followed by a roll of thunder and a flash of lightning, doing however no harm. What does this mean? I asked Cravatu, and he replied, I perceive that these people speak a language different from our own. They are spirits of sound, and express their thoughts in music. What they mean to say is that they are peaceable, if we let them alone, but that they have the power to defend themselves if we trouble them. Prove it, I involuntarily exclaimed, for I had adopted instinctively the habit of the princess, who wanted proofs for everything. It is not a matter for proving, but of understanding, answered Cravatu. But how are we going to reply? I asked, where can we find a dictionary of music, and who is going to compose the music, or fiddle it to them? Upon this Cravatu said, the language of music used to be known to us as the music of nature. In olden times the gnomes could understand it and speak it, and required no dictionary for its interpretation, because their simple minds understood that simple language. But now we gnomes have become so learned and scientific, and our minds so complicated, that it is possible for hardly anyone to understand a simple thing, or to express himself in a simple manner. Fortunately, I still find some knowledge of music in my rapidly fading memory, but I cannot answer in music. However, I know the language of flowers, and this is also an universal and natural language, somewhat akin to music, and, if I am not mistaken, these spirits will understand it. This ingenuity of Cravatu pleased me very much. He was in fact still sound at heart, one of the brightest of the gnomes, and in spite of the progress of civilization, in the midst of which he moved, he had still a certain amount of perception of truth, although on that very account he was much exposed to the ridicule of the scientists and made a target for their wit, because they did not believe in such a thing as intuition, and said that nobody could know anything except by way of information, inference, and by a trained imagination. Cravatu now called some of the Achnasi, who, by the mysterious power which they possess, can create visible objects out of the invisible images existing everywhere in the astral light, and ordered them to produce a white rose. This they did, and caused it to float slowly up through the hole. What does this signify? I asked, and Cravatu answered, the white rose asks, may I approach you? We waited a while. When down through the tunnel floated an euphorbia, we saw it plainly, and had ample time to examine it, but at the moment when it touched the earth it vanished. This flower Cravatu interpreted as being intended to say, Why do you persecute us? Up went a heliotrope to tell them, my heart longs for you. And the answer came back in the shape of a belladonna, indicating, we do not credit the honesty of your intentions. To this we replied by sending up a white lily for the purpose of testifying to the purity of our affection, whereupon we received a violet bidding us, hope. Up again went a daffodil, to ask them not to be so cruel as to let us pine away in hopeless misery, and we waited. A consultation seemed to take place among the bees. A great number of small lights were seen to gather around a large blue light in the middle, and a melodious humming was heard. Directly a leaf of a fern floated down, bringing the answer, I will meet you, and in return we sent up a geranium to inform them that we were waiting. Soon after that a clear and beautiful accord was heard, and something luminous floated down through the tunnel, which I could not describe otherwise than as being an oval-shaped radiance of an exquisite rose-colored light, composed of living sound and emitting harmonious accords, like an Aeolian harp. When it issued from the mouth of the tunnel, I perceived within its sphere the ethereal shape of an oleander blossom, in the midst of which appeared the childlike and smiling face of a most charming fairy. These were then the spirits of flowers. Cravatu presented the fairy with a jessamine blossom as a token of friendship and invited her to accompany us to the king. An accord, indicating consent, was the answer, and we returned with the fairy in our midst. Bring the prisoner! Exclaimed Adalga, assuming an air of scientific arrogance when she saw us approaching. This rudeness offended me, and I said, this is not a prisoner, princess, but an ambassador coming to us upon our invitation and under the flag of truce. It is a fairy of high descent, and the law of justice demands that she be treated respectfully. Prove it, answered the princess angrily. Justice, I said, is not a thing to be proved, but to be practiced. While I spoke, the oleander blossom gave forth a sweet melody of harmonious sounds, but Adalga looked at the fairy with a wicked glance in her eye, and said, a curious specimen, which we must not let escape. It will be quite an ornament to our museum. It will be no such thing, I answered indignantly. This noble fairy is under my protection, and I shall protect her. But the princess retorted in a haughty manner. The interests of science are first of all to be taken into consideration. It may not be strictly correct in a legal sense to retain the prisoner, but the end justifies the means. To this the king added, I always told you so, the end justifies the means. Upon this Adalga made a vicious grab at the oleander blossom, trying to capture it, but did not succeed. For the rose-colored radiance at once became transformed into a column of red vapor, which whirled away, while from its interior came a discordant sound indicative of disappointment and sorrow. The princess flew into a rage, and elongating her body to the full length, struck at the column of vapor, but only to fall upon her nose, for the red cloud had already passed beyond her reach. We followed the fairy, but could only see the rose-colored light floating back into the tunnel, where it disappeared, and after a little while a mournful strain of music was heard. We sent up a variety of flowers with a hope of renewing the negotiations, but they were not accepted. We received nothing but a rain of ashes, indicating that all prospects for an amicable understanding were at an end. This failure to catch the spirit of sound caused to the princess a great deal of vexation, and she blamed us for not having closed up the mouth of the tunnel to prevent the return of the fairy. To this I replied, there is a certain amount of honor even among thieves, but to a person absorbed by a greed for gratifying his scientific curiosity in regard to that which belongs to the higher life, nothing is inviolable or sacred, and nothing safe from his attempts to uselessly and foolishly cause its destruction. Too clumsy, stupid, and cowardly to try to rise up to a conception of high and exalted ideals, those would-be scientists and pseudo-philosophers would like to entice those ideals, allure them by false promises, and drag them down into the manure in which they themselves love to roll. But thanks to the laws of the eternal spirit in nature, true goodness cannot be approached by evil, wisdom is not comprehensible to the fool, and purity does not amalgamate with filth. Prove it, she cried, probably more from force of habit than as a result of reflection. For some remnant of reason left in her mind seemed to make her feel the idiocy of her requests, and, changing the subject, she said, "Who is it that has caused me to pry with curious eyes behind the veil of the unknown, and to strive to outstrip my own natural growth? Who caused the loss of my light, my beauty and purity, destroyed my ideals, and made me a slave to doubt? Who, but you yourself, has caused me to treat reason with contempt, to become blind through vanity and deformed by skepticism? Who, but you, has presented us with a knowledge of evil, which to overcome we have not become strong enough? Who, but you, took away our power by causing us to expend it in channels that did not belong to our true nature? You caused us to lose our ethereal state, so that now we have to creep like worms upon the earth, instead of sailing like eagles through space on wings of freedom, as was the custom of our race before you arrived. Now the hellish work has begun, and it shall be finished, let the cost be what it may. The end must be made to justify the means." The determined and clear manner in which Hidalga spoke pleased me very much. It proved to me that there was still a lingering spark of reason in her. It was as if the falling upon her nose had awakened her finer sensibilities, and I was about to enter into a discussion of philosophical questions with her, but she would not listen. Turning to the king, she requested him to declare war immediately to the superior kingdom, to force its doors open, and to select the best troops for making the assault. "You are the ruler of the world," she said to the king. "You are great and wise. No one will dare to resist you." "Of course," answered the king, being much tickled by her flattering words, and assuming an air of self-importance. "I am the ruler of the world. I am great and wise. No one will dare to resist me. I will exterminate the spirits of the superior kingdom." The troops were gathered, and of each division the best individuals selected for making the first assault under the command of Clavo. But now a great difficulty presented itself at the very start, for even the common people among the gnomes had become so much accustomed to arguing that not a soldier would obey an order without having all the whys and wherefores explained to him. Each private wanted to know why this or that order was given, and whether it would be advisable to follow it, and what it was intended for, and whether not perhaps something better might be done, and so forth. This caused an endless delay, because, for the purpose of obtaining the consent of the subordinates to follow an order, the commanding general had to explain his views and argue his points with the officers. The officers had to reason it out with the corporals, and they in their turn had to discuss it with the privates and obtain their consent. Some thought the given order practicable, others made objections and refused to obey, and nobody could be induced to act against his own views. From this state of affairs there arose a great deal of delay, difficulties, and waste of time. But at last the assault was made. They were driven back with great loss, and others took their places, but with the same result. The most obstinate gnomes were sent forward, and for 2 nights lasted the battle, in which wonderful deeds of stubbornness and daring were accomplished, with no other effect than bringing destruction upon the gnomes and doing no harm to the fairies, whose stronghold was inaccessible. For whenever our soldiers rushed up through the tunnel, a single effusion of lightning was sufficient to kill the greater portion of them, while the rest were driven back mutilated and scorched. Thus the flower of the kingdom of the gnomes was destroyed. The wails of the widows and orphans resounded, and the king wept unceasingly, beating the air with his arms in sheer despair and impotent fury. Nevertheless, owing to the persuasions of the princess, the gnomes would not desist. She made the king believe that, according to her theory about the exhaustion of energy, the lightning power of the fairies could not endure very long, and the king believed all she said. "If we cannot go up to them," she said, "we must make them come down." To this end she instituted sham flights among the troops, hoping to induce the elves to pursue them, and she tried all possible means for beguiling the inhabitants of the upper realm and lead them into a trap. She made to them all kinds of false promises, but those spirits saw that her motive was not pure. She tried to attract them by her song, but her voice had become harsh and disagreeable, like the screeching of an owl. In fact, I must confess it, although it may not be considered nice to speak ill of a lady, especially if she is one's intended wife, that Hidalga had become somewhat disagreeable. This war brought out the worst traits of her character, and no means were too contemptible for her to employ, provided they held out a prospect to her for accomplishing what she desired. It has already been stated that, at the time which corresponded to day in our world, the gnomes fell into a death-like sleep, from which they did not awaken until night settled upon the earth. Not being a gnome, I was not subject to the law of their nature, but could remain awake and observe what was taking place during their sleep. Thus, during the third day after the beginning of the struggle, I was lying awake in the camp, while all the gnomes were asleep. I was watching the entrance of the tunnel, which appeared like a circular opening in the clouds, through which issued a faint light, when suddenly it became illumined by a roseate radiance of great beauty, somewhat like the aurora borealis or northern light. At the same time I heard a chant as of angel voices, and directly afterwards there issued from the tunnel a bevy of the most charming fairies, each representing a luminous living flower, with a beautiful face in its midst. There were oleanders, orange blossoms, roses, camellias, anemones, pansies, forget-me-nots, daffodils, etc., and out of the chalice or heart of each looked a childlike face, peaceful and smiling. But the greatest and most radiant of all was a white lotus flower, in whose midst dwelt the fairy queen, with a crown of diamonds upon her head. I was not at all alarmed. I saw, if I am permitted to use such an unscientific expression, that they intended no harm. It would have been useless to attempt to awaken the sleeping gnomes. I therefore remained still, and looked at the spirits of the flowers through my half-closed lids. They moved about among the sleepers, singing and scattering blossoms, and when they came to the place where Adalga slept, they drew around her in a circle, throwing flowers upon her, such beautiful ones as I had never seen before, and which did not fade away either when they touched the ground. But the princess smiled in her sleep, as if she had a pleasant dream, and her features assumed an expression that made her look agreeable in spite of her ugliness. The fairies stood regarding the sleeper with great attention, while pity and hope were expressed in their faces, and the lotus flower stepped out of her chalice, and sang in a silvery voice a song in a language which I did not understand literally, but whose sentiments became clear to my heart, and might perhaps be expressed in the following lines. We are the spirits of the voice of truth, symbols of beauty, harmony, and youth. We teach thee wisdom from the sphere above, if thou wilt listen to our song of love. Without the darkness light cannot be known. To know truth, falsehood must be overthrown. Peace without effort would be death to thee. Not but the battle leads to victory. Without a struggle there's no joy and rest. Only through evil good can manifest. Without the dust of earth no plant will grow, and no one rise who never fell below. Naught comes from naught, and no amount of toil will raise a fruit tree from a barren soil. But the good seed within the hotbed needs no other help but rooting out the weeds. Knowledge is power, but it serves you not, unless you practice that which you were taught. Toil without knowledge is a fruitless tree. Science unused is naught but theory. Knowledge is power, but remember well you must yourself destroy the magic spell. And Lucifer, who came but to redeem, redeems you only if you conquer him. Thus the Queen of the Lotus ended her song, and floated away with her companions. The last I saw of them was a roseate light shining from the mouth of the tunnel. I then fell asleep myself, and slept until I was awakened by the blowing of horns, the blast of trumpets, and beating of drums, calling the troops together for a renewal of the fight, and those who were so inclined got up and joined the ranks. I went to the princess, and found her to be in a pensive mood, while her loquaciousness was less than usually active, a circumstance which I attributed to the visit of the fairies. I asked her whether she had experienced a pleasant dream. I do not believe in dreams, she answered. Scientists never attribute any importance to dreams or to subjective experiences. Our attention is fully engaged by the objective realities of life. Confound your false science, I said. It deals, after all, with nothing but appearances and dreams. The fairies seem to me very objective. So you saw them, replied Adalga. Perhaps it was your thought transfer which caused that hallucination. Let it be what it may, I said. It is of little importance from what we receive a lesson. The lesson itself is that which we ought to consider. We are not in the habit of accepting lessons, she answered, unless they come from some well-recognized authority. To this I answered, truth is truth, no matter by whom it is uttered. "Prove it!" exclaimed the princess, and as I remained silent, she continued, sneeringly, "If we are asked to listen to a theory, the first thing is to inquire about the claims for credibility of him who puts them forth. Upon what authority does his assertion rest? What books can he quote for the support of his opinion? If all this is settled, we may listen to his proofs and decide whether we will accept them or not." I groaned. "Alas," I said, "in your science it is all creed, but no perception of truth." Off she went, and soon cries of distress were heard between the explosions that followed. The storming party was beaten back. A fresh attack was ordered, but the troops had become disheartened and refused to enter the tunnel. Some, however, were inclined to proceed and called the others cowards. And this led to a quarrel among the troops, which resulted in a fight, and the fight developed into an open revolt, during which it soon became plain that the mutineers were in great strength. In vain the king butted his head against everything that happened to come in his way. In vain the princess proved by irrefutable arguments that the loyal troops could not be conquered. They were beaten anyhow, and we were driven back with them in the direction of Lucifer's temple. Soon after that we were pressed so hard that we had to seek shelter behind the walls. Multitudes thronged in after us, and many more sought to enter, but could find no room. The space became so crowded that the gnomes pushed each other and struggled for room. Thus they pressed against the pedestal of the queen frog, some climbing upon it, others trying to climb. And in the midst of the uproar the monster began to sway, and, losing its balance, it fell. A crash followed. The frog was broken to pieces, and volumes of poisonous vapor coming from the phosphorus filled the place. Instinctively I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again the whole assembly of gnomes had become transformed into animals. Bim Bam I had turned into an ox, rushing madly through the crowd. In the place of the commanding general stood a sheep, and, to my horror, I beheld a big goat in the place of the princess. Cravatu had become a black lizard, with yellow spots, and all the rest of the gnomes now appeared in animal forms. There were bats flying about, mice rushing into holes, spiders crawling over the walls, and two ministers, having turned into brass beetles, were rolling a ball of dirt over the ground. Cats squalled, rats whistled, frogs croaked, sheep bleated, dogs yowled and barked, and the whole was in a terrible confusion. The goat stared at me in an offensive manner, which I was bound to resent. So I said, "You need not stare at me in this manner. Is this your gratitude for my conferring upon you the blessings of civilization? Is this the thanks which I am to receive from you for teaching you logic and how to draw inferences from postulates? To you we owe all this misfortune. It is your confounded curiosity that made you meddle with things for whose conception you were not mature, and which you could not realize, that brought about this war. The stubbornness with which you kept clinging to your preconceived opinions has caused this mutiny. Now you have turned into a goat, and I can only say it served you right." The goat tried to speak, but brought forth only a stuttering "mah-h," which sounded to me like the ironical laughter of a scientist of old laughing at the rotundity of the earth. The princess, that is to say, the goat, lowered her head. "You need not get angry," I exclaimed, feeling somewhat alarmed. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself. I wish that I had never seen you. I am only sorry that it is I who is to be married to a goat." But before I had time to finish this sentence, the goat made a vicious rush at me and gave me a butt on my stomach which took my breath. I grasped the princess by her horns, and a struggle ensued. Just then I heard somebody yell in an unearthly manner, and recognized the voice as that of Professor Cracker. In a moment the situation became perfectly clear to me, and I was no longer Mulligan, but Mr. Schneider. Jeremiah Stiffbone was close to me, calling upon somebody to have pity upon his soul, and from under him there came forth a series of indefinite grunts, in which I recognized Mr. Scalawag's voice. The goat escaped, and I knew that we still were in that hole in the Untersberg, near the dragon's den, and that my adventure among the gnomes had been only a dream. The rest may easily be imagined. The subterranean passage, into which we had entered for obtaining shelter, had another outlet upon the other side of the hill, and through that a herd of goats had come in for some purpose, but the rest of one of them had been rudely disturbed by the foot of Professor Cracker. No serious harm, however, was done. while the experience was not without scientific value, as it proved that the goat was very spirited, a circumstance that might be regarded as going to show that there was some spirit after all in that goat. This theory however, advance merely as a working hypothesis, leaving it to the reader to use his own judgment as to whether he will accept it as wholly true or only in part. Thus Mr. Schneider's story ended, and nothing has been heard publicly of the gnomes ever since. It is even believed that they keep their doors locked against all reformers. But, in commemoration of the event described, a board has been put up in the Dragon's Den, upon which a representation of the encounter between the committee and the spirit of that goat has been roughly painted by an amateur artist. And below the picture there is a description of the adventure in doggerel verse, which caused me a great deal of trouble to translate, but which might be rendered in English as follows. Stop, wanderer, and behold with silent contemplation how exact science fought interior revelation. The cleverest thing that Cracker had invented was by a stupid goat, with her two horns resented. Alas, such is the fate of all the would-be wise. We only know for sure that which we realize. The end.